Okay, now we're live. So again, we're going to start with the Allegory of the Cave, and this comes from Plato's Republic. Actually, it's one of his largest books. I think the Laws, which is unfinished, is a little bit longer, but the Republic is one of his most famous, most influential works, and the subject of the Republic ostensibly is justice. What is justice in the individual? What is a just society? The Allegory of the Cave comes from kind of the middle of the book, and it's usually seen primarily as a metaphysical allegory. So an allegory, and I think we did cover this last time. An allegory, it's a narrative, it's a story, a myth. In fact, sometimes this is referred to as a myth, not an allegory, but it has symbolic meaning. So in other words, all the elements in the story are supposed to be telling you something about the world around you, right? There's a parallelism between what's going on in the story. So many authors read this as many commentators read this as primarily a metaphysical allegory. Plato is giving you his picture of reality, what is real and what is the nature of reality, and this story helps to illustrate it. And I don't want to push back on that reading. I think that's a good reading, but there's a lot of other layers to it as well. You can find political layers, ethical layers, even you might even argue Plato. He even gives us a bit of his epistemology, his theory of knowledge in this Allegory of the Cave. But I want to use it today to just sort of demonstrate kind of our purpose in this class. We've been talking about arguments a whole bunch. In fact, I think we spent too much time maybe on arguments last time, and that's why I didn't really get through the allegory. And again, maybe I'm confusing you guys with one of my other intro classes at TSU. So if you've heard this before and you're like, wait, you covered all this, let's just move on. Yeah, feel free to stop me. But the story basically begins with Socrates telling us about this cave with a bunch of prisoners in it. And so I've picked one of these illustrations. You can find tons of these on the internet. If you just do a Google image search of Plato's cave, you'll probably find a lot of similar. This is maybe not even the best one. But it's an illustration of the story that Socrates is telling. And he says that imagine there's a cave with these prisoners in it, and they spent their whole life, let's assume, as prisoners in this cave. And so here if you're looking at the picture I have on my PowerPoint, you see the prisoners at the bottom left. They have their backs against this wall, this stone wall that's been built, and in front of them is the cave wall. So their whole life, all they're able to do is look at that cave wall in front of them. That is their reality. And behind the wall, right? So they got their backs against this wall. They're all chained up. They can't turn around. They can't see the cave behind them. But behind them is a bonfire, right? This bonfire up here on the platform. And every once in a while, this procession will walk out. All these men or women or whoever, these people in robes, these mysterious, individuals will walk behind the wall and will lift up these puppets, these sort of silhouette cutouts. So, every once in a while, the prisoners will look at the wall in front of them and see these shadows. They'll see the shadows of, this. So this guy's holding a puppet with or it looks like a vase. It's like a little silhouette of a vase. And so they're looking at a shadow of a vase, and then a horse and a ring, and so on. At this point of the story, Socrates is telling his friend about this cave and the prisoners, and he gets interrupted, and the guy says, "This is kind of weird. What strange prisoners? What a strange scenario." And Socrates replies, "Not really. They're just like us." So keep that in mind. We'll come back to that point in a minute. But somehow we are like these prisoners in a cave in our lives, and we are just like them, staring at these shadows on the wall. But he tells us of a prisoner who somehow is able to escape. Maybe somebody lets them go. Somebody has pity on them. Maybe one of these guys holding the puppets has had enough of exploiting and lying to them and wants to guide him towards truth. Or maybe the change just break, and he wakes up one morning, and the prisoner sees that they're free to turn their head around, and for the first time they see the wall behind them, and they see these guys, right, that walk out every once in a while, and the fire, and for the prisoner that does this, this is going to be quite unsettling. And why is that the case? This is a detail I guess I probably skipped, which I should have sort of paused for a minute here. Let's imagine if you're one of these prisoners in the cave looking at these shadows on the wall. And so again, this is all you've known your whole life. Would you know that you're looking at shadows? So when you see these shadows come out, would you say, oh, look, there's a shadow of a vase. There must be a vase behind me. There's a shadow of a horse. There must be a horse. Is that how you would look at these, do you think, or what?
No, you wouldn't know what they are.
Right. Well, you'd probably come up with some name for them, right? If you saw, shapes that were like this that came out, often enough, you'd probably say, oh, that's one of those type of things, and that's one of those type of things. But you wouldn't see them as a shadow. You would actually think of them as an actual thing, right? You wouldn't really know what they truly were, though. I think that's the point for Plato. You would have a very deficient, distorted view of truth. You would have the shadow of truth. But once the prisoner is able to escape, once the prisoner is able to break free and is able to see the fire and the puppets and all that, for the first time in their life, not only do they know what they've actually been looking at, its shadows, but they know the cause, they know the reason behind it, and so that's a sort of fuller, more complete picture of reality. Whereas these prisoners down here are stuck with their kind of like just passive acceptance of the shadows, whatever is presented towards them. Somebody's asking me if I could record the lecture. I'm already on top of it. We are recording. So anyway, this is not the end of the story, obviously, right? You see in the picture here, the guy actually gets out of the cave eventually. It's not an easy task, though. The passageway is very narrow and steep, and it's very difficult. But eventually, after a while, the prisoner's able to find a way out. And, here we got this guy. He gets to the top. And this is one thing I don't like about this particular illustration that I picked. Usually you see the sun. The guy gets out and the sunlight is there and the sun is bright and beating down on him. And I mean, how would you react, do you think, physically, if you were one of these cave dwellers who for the first time in your life came to the surface? Like how would that affect you just physically? I mean, you'd probably
You
be
wouldn't be able to see.
right, you would be blinded by the light. It's like not only would you be overwhelmed psychologically, like holy crap, there's even more to this than I thought, but you would literally not even be able to see anything because you'd be blinded by the light. You can interpret this, I guess Plato is sort of saying, once you get out of the cave and see the truth, it's so overwhelming and maybe it's too much to accept, or it's just so complicated, or so you have to be so intelligent that it's almost overwhelming. You can't handle it. But after a while, eventually, the person who escapes is able to adjust. Their eyes adjust to the surface light. They're able to see everything. They're able to see all the different objects out there, the trees and the and the forest itself and the clouds and everything. And so they have this full knowledge finally of the universe. No longer are they looking at shadows on the wall and just blindly accepting what they've been given and told that's true and just accept it as reality passively. But they've explored the whole furniture of the universe, and now they have this complete picture. Maybe some of you have heard this story before. I hear it from time to time, like people like to use it. It gets appropriated a lot. I think misappropriated sometimes, to be honest with you. But what happens next, do you think? What would the next move be? If you were this prisoner who escaped the cave, you got out, you kind of figured out what was going on, you realize, man, I've been lied to my whole life. All that I thought was real is just a shadow. You know, once you got kind of used to that and you had a fuller grip on reality, what do you think you do after you were done exploring, after you were finished sort of exploring the surface? Anybody have any clues what comes next? Uh, the next move was to have someone else to socialize. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Ronnie. Are you mean like so you would look for other people to hang out with? Well, yeah, like I said, I think your last name is Crocker, Christie, I guess, or Chrissy. Um, yeah, after you're done exploring, like once, let's say you're done exploring, you've kind of like learned all you can learn. What would the temptation be? And let's say you've socialized, you met people on the surface, you have friends now up above. What would, yeah, Ali's got it, right? He says, go back and tell the people from the cave. And he's even a step ahead of that. He says, they'll never believe you, but you try. Exactly, good point. Both good points. This is the part of the story where Plato, you know, he says, yes, or Socrates is the one doing all the talking. We'll talk about that in a minute. What's the relationship between Plato and Socrates? But anyway, in the story, the guy goes back to the cave, and this, you can interpret it ethically. This is where I think there's an ethical element here. Plato was never very clear about any sort of ethics. He wrote quite a few dialogues that covered ethics and virtue, but he never wrote like Aristotle did. He never wrote like some ethical treatise. So there's a lot of debate about Platonic ethics. But I think one of the more common interpretations, which I think is pretty plausible, is that at the very least, one of the things that gets in the way of goodness and justice is ignorance and not having knowledge. And that if you know what's right, and if you know what's good, and you know what's just, Plato seems to think that you're going to do it. That just simply knowing it, because if you're wise and you're good and you're just and you know what all that stuff is, you're going to want to act that way. You're going to know it's the best thing to be. It's the best for your soul. And so this part of the story, I guess the guy gets out of the cave, the prisoner escapes, and realizes what the good is and what the just is and what is really true. And part of justice is going back to the cave to try to tell those prisoners what's going on. Hey, guys, these are just shadows, by the way. You've been lied to. Behind you, there are these guys with puppets, and there's a bonfire. And beyond that, there's an exit to this cave, and you can get to the surface, and there's clouds and trees. But as you said, Ali, they're not going to want to believe him. They're going to be very skeptical. For one, there's maybe good reasons why they wouldn't believe him. You got to imagine, just like when he got out of the cave and he was blinded by the light of the sun, now that he's used to the sunlight and he's used to the surface light, he's got to go back down to the dark cave, and now he's got to readjust. And maybe, he's talking to them about all this stuff they'd never heard of. So they're like, what are you talking about? Trees and clouds and fire. What the hell? There's just this. That's what are you talking about? You're crazy. Not only that, but he's probably like tripping all over the place, bumping into walls because, he's just, grasping around in the dark. He's still not used to how it used to be back in the cave. Okay. And so I think one way we can interpret this is that, when you get down back there to the cave and you're trying to enlighten other people, that they're not going to want to listen. They're not going to believe you. And there's not much you can do. You can't really make them take the journey, or you can't tell them all the stuff you saw on your journey and get them to understand it. You have to let them take the journey themselves, and they have to do it of their own accord. The way Socrates puts it in the story, he says that all you can do is you can point their soul in the right direction. And what that means, I suppose, is not exactly clear, but one way I guess you could answer that question is the way Socrates did, through the Socratic method. That's what he's probably most famous for. And Socrates was known for just asking questions. He would go to people and ask them, well, why do you believe what you believe? What do you think is truth? What do you think is justice? What do you think is beauty? And then once they gave him an answer, he would try to he would interrogate them about their answer. Well, why do you think that? Why would you define beauty that way? And he would come up with counterexamples and get them to think about themselves. And this is very unsettling for some people, right? So this is why it's difficult maybe for people to do philosophy and such. But we'll talk about the difficulties of that and sort of how that fits into the scheme of this class. But first, I want to ask you guys, what do you think's going on in the story? I kind of skipped over this part. I mentioned how Socrates says that, in a sense, we're all like this, that we're all, in a certain sense, at least maybe when we're born, when we're young, uh, our view of the world is much like the prisoner's view of the world. How is that the case? I mean, how are we in a similar situation? Um, Maybe I'll give you a hint on how I'd like you to try to think about answering that question. Obviously, there's somebody here controlling the puppet show, the shadows, right? Who do you think he has in mind? Somebody who's about to jump in. What were you going to say? Was that you, Ollie? I thought I heard somebody about to jump in.
It's the media.
That's not exactly, I think, who Plato had in mind, but I think that would be probably more appropriate today. Yeah. I think today, yeah, I think you're right. I think the media is a good answer. Like, you know, we kind of just believe like social media, the news media. Miss Crocker says your parents. That one I think is a relevant way to answer that. In a way, I don't think that's who Plato has in mind, because, you know, although it's fair, I think your parents do that, right? When you're young, they don't tell you like everything about the world. They give you sort of the PG version of it, the sugar coated. You know, the world's an ugly place, so it's almost a good sort of lie, I guess. And he believed that. He thought there was a good way to lie. Plato did. He thought there was a noble lie, and I guess he would argue that you're. But yeah, I think you're right that the media is certainly. But he had in mind something different. Which, anybody else? Someone says they're having trouble hearing me. I think you probably just logged in. You might just give it a second. Maybe the audio will come on, although you can't hear me. So they just messaged me privately. If anyone else is having trouble hearing me, let me know. But it doesn't seem like they are.
No, you sound fine.
All right. So I just responded to them in the chat group. So what else? So someone mentioned parents, the media, others' perceptions. Yeah, I guess other people's perceptions, but like who? Like what groups? You mentioned the government. Good. That's the ruling class, right? Those who are in charge. That's who Plato, I think, had primarily in mind. Remember, I said that this comes from the Republic, which is mainly a political work, and so yeah, he thought of, you know, politicians. They'll distort the truth. They'll lie about certain things in order to, I guess, misinform the people to get people to vote for them, whatever, you know, that kind of thing. And I like that you said the media, because to me that's sort of like in sort of modern society, it seems like most people get their view of the world through their media, the media that they consume. And I'm a bit of a news junkie. I'm a bit of a news junkie myself. I don't watch a lot of American news. It gets on my nerves. I think like most of mainstream American news channels have become like propaganda. So like I go to like, there's a few exceptions here and there, but like I usually do like a lot of independent journalism and like foreign news. But even then you can kind of tell, you know, when you go to like, trying to think of an example, like Al Jazeera, for instance, is like, it's in Qatar. And so like, they're never going to say anything like really that critical of like the Saudis or things like that. Or if they do, they get punished for it. I think like a few years ago that happened. And so it's like, you kind of know, like, you know, when you watch Fox News, for example, obviously, I don't think that they really lie that much. That term fake news is overused, I would say. It's rare that they just straight up lie, but a lot of times they just don't present the whole story, right? They don't give you the full picture. You know, if you watch Fox News, you're just going to get the information and the facts that make their side of the story look good, or that makes the other side look bad. And if you go to, what is it, MSNBC, it's going to be the same thing on the other side. They're going to, anything negative that the Republicans did, they're going to over-report it. And anything, you know, negative that the Democrats did, they won't even mention it, you know. And so, you know, this is kind of a similar situation. I guess you've got these these guys are looking at shadows, and I guess the shadows look like the actual things. Like the shadow of the vase looks like the shadow, but it's a sort of distorted, elongated version of it. It's distorted to, I guess Plato's thinking of politicians here. It's distorted in order to like brainwash these people into believing a certain. Yeah, I agree, Chrissy. They do straight up lie on Fox, but I think they don't lie. Like they also lie on MSNBC. They lie on all of them. I think like and if you think they don't, then you just you're not really being. I think you're not being critical or self-critical enough, right? Or you just don't watch them enough, right? I think that's the problem is people get in their little bubbles. To me, this little cave here is like a bubble, and in a way the media has made it so difficult to sort of make heads or tails of like really anything from my perspective. I don't even know who to trust anymore. That's why I try to consume news from different sources, because it seems like, even then you got to realize like what's the source, who runs this place, who are their advertisers, like who's their major advertisers, where do they get their money from, and obviously everyone's going to have their own bias, including yourself. So you got to think, well, maybe I'm biased, and so maybe I'm looking at this story a certain way. So I think that what's that? I'm not saying they don't lie on others, but not like the Fox pundit. I watch them from all the likes. Yeah, I think, well, again, that's the problem with media too. You mentioned pundits, is that like it's all become like not even news. It's just like political talking heads, and most of them either work for like the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. They're all former campaign managers or whatever, and so that's not to say that what they say is not true. Sometimes they do say things that are true and relevant, but obviously I think they have a bias and certainly have a political axe to grind. The thing is, what you want to do is you want to like check the evidence. I think so many people just accept things without asking why, like, well, what's the reason behind it? And in this class, that's why we spend all that time talking about arguments. It's like, it's one thing to make a claim, but what is your claim backed up with? You just believe it because this source said it? Even if it's a source that you trust, even if it's like, well, my dad said it. It's like, yeah, and I'm sure your dad loves you and you love your dad, but is your dad an expert at this? And even if he's an expert, maybe he was like, maybe sometimes even experts can be wrong. So you have to understand, well, why does the expert believe that? What's the reasoning behind it? We need to see the evidence, the reasons, why it's established, before we can really judge whether or not it's a good argument or not. Otherwise, I guess we're just in a similar situation as these prisoners. We're just sort of, okay, I guess that's the truth. I guess I'll just accept it. And so I guess the best we can do, I think, is to try to at least get behind these little puppet masters. Now, I don't want to mislead you, though. I think some people, they hear this story of the cave, they hear Plato's allegory of the cave, and they start to think about it like, oh, they start to like Plato, and they're, oh, Plato's cool. He wants us to think for ourselves and like not be brainwashed, and he wants us to escape the prison of propaganda that people in power try to impose on us. But I want to be careful. Plato was not exactly like a nice guy as far as that's concerned. He actually believed that it was a rare breed of human being. It was very few people who were able to actually get out of that cave, to actually get all the way up and out of the cave. Only the philosopher, and only a few philosophers, after years and years of study and reflection, could they get out and see this sort of full picture of the universe. And, to his credit, he thought that the duty of someone who does this is to go back to the cave and find others and to guide them out as well. But he also thought that there were some people who would never get out of the cave, and they would never, ever be able to escape, and they would be prisoners for life. So, he thought that, it depended on the type of soul that you have. Apparently, each of us have different types of souls. And for Plato, some of our souls are dominated by a desire for wealth or for pleasure. And if we have that kind of soul, we're not going to get that far out of the cave. We're just going to accept appearances. Whatever pleases us, whatever makes us feel good or makes us money, we're going to believe it, whether it's true or not. If we're getting rich or we feel good about it, we're going to believe it. So if we have that kind of soul, we're screwed. Then there's another type of soul he thought that was more guided by honor and justice and what's right and wrong for the society. And he thought that they could get a little bit further up out of the cave. But only the philosopher, the one who only wanted truth and beauty and goodness for its own sake, not because it got him rich or famous or pleasure or because it got her anything else, but only because it's just good to be good. So this is why he thinks that in the perfect society, the philosophers should be in charge of everything, and it's actually okay for them to lie to people. It's not good to lie. You know, these people are evil because they're promoting bad lies. They're just lying so they can maintain power. They're just lying so they can get rich and rip off their society. But the good philosopher, they're lying in order to guide the people that wouldn't do good otherwise. So they'll tell them lies like, if you're really good, Zeus will give you a reward. If you're really good, then the Greek gods will reward you in the afterlife. So be a good boy and don't steal, right? Normally they would steal and be greedy, but so the philosopher has to lie to them and to tell them all this stuff, right? So again, I don't want to give you some illusion that Plato was this sort of democratic thinking, everyone should be liberated from their ignorance. That wasn't his solution, although maybe that is the solution, right? We don't want to be authoritarian like Plato, I hope. We want to believe, at least have faith, that through the right education, through the proper instruction, that we can at least get halfway through the cave. At least we won't just be staring at shadows our whole life. At least we can cross our fingers for that. Maybe we won't be able to see the light of goodness of the sun and see how everything fits universally together. But I certainly hope that with at least a semester of philosophy under your belt, you'll be able to think a little bit more critically about things that you're told instead of just accepting them because they sound good or because you like the person who said them or because somebody with a degree said them. You actually believe them because you've thought about the reasons and you've weighed the evidence and you've come to a conclusion that's based on good reasoning, right? That's the ideal scenario, I suppose, that we're aiming for here. Anyway, I think I've exhausted the allegory of the cave as much as I'm going to, so I'm going to move on. Finally, get to at least a start on our first reading, the apology. And before I get to that, I want to do a little bit of background information, not too much. If you're curious about Socrates as a person or Plato and you want to read their biography, there's tons of great information out there on the internet. I know Stanford has an encyclopedia of philosophy that's pretty good. But I want to kind of lay out the basics. So I want to talk a little bit about the Sophists, who were a group of men. I have Protagoras. I can't even spell his name right. I have Protagoras here listed. He was a sophist. He's one of the most famous sophists. I want to talk a little bit about them because I think that Socrates is sort of, he's referring to them in the dialogue a few times, not necessarily by name, but I think he definitely has the sophists in mind. So I'll talk a little bit about them just to get started, who they were and what was their sort of deal, and then talk a little bit about Socrates himself, and then we'll jump into the reading. And I don't know, probably get maybe like into like 5 or 10 pages into it if we're lucky. So who were the Sophists? Now these guys, they were men who made quite a lot of money as, I guess, what you would probably call a tutor. They were tutors, teachers to the wealthy. They would go around all these Greek cities, the bigger cities like Athens and Sparta, and they would charge a lot of money to teach young rich kids, basically. Well, what they told them is that they would teach them how to benefit themselves and to harm their enemies, how to benefit their friends and make sure no harm came to themselves or their friends, and to manage their affairs, both privately and publicly, in the best, most successful way. That was basically their shtick, right? Like, you know, pay us money and we'll basically tell you how to succeed in life. Almost like one of these like gurus on, on Facebook or Twitter when you're scrolling through and they're like, join my make $1 million club, or, get rich quick guru guys, right? That's kind of what they were. But what they were known for teaching, actually, more than anything else, was rhetoric, the art of rhetoric. Now, what anybody familiar with what is rhetoric? What does that even mean? You can actually, I think that sometimes if you take English 1301, I don't know if that's what they call it here, but I know it's like at some universities, 1301, 1302, it's composition and rhetoric, 1, and composition and rhetoric 2, or whatever. No one knows what that word means, though. Rhetoric.
Is it like the art of like persuasion?
Pretty much. That's a good way to define it. That might be too general, but it kind of hits the nail on the head more or less. It's how to use language to be persuasive is maybe a better way to put it. How do you use language to persuade people, or how to use language how to use style to affect a certain response from somebody. So why do you think that would be a skill that would be so worth learning? And why would all these rich kids, have their parents spend all this money, and these guys got all this money to learn rhetoric? Why do you think rhetoric was such a useful tool in ancient Athens or Sparta, all these Greek city-states? What could you do with that?
They wanted them to be politicians. And
right. Yeah, good. Right, yeah.
People.
Mm-hmm. I like Miss Crocker's response, sort of like a con artist. Yeah, pretty much. I usually say lawyer, but I don't want to offend my lawyer friends. I have friends that practice law, and I'm sure some of y'all maybe want to be lawyers someday, maybe. So maybe I shouldn't say that. But in a way, the lawyer analogy is kind of it's kind of appropriate, because your answers are the more obvious answers, and that's the more obvious reason, for politics, for political power, to persuade people to do whatever you want and that kind of thing. But also, if you ever had to face any legal cases, if somebody accused you of a crime and you had to face a court, you actually had to defend yourself. You weren't given a lawyer to represent you. You had to represent yourself. And so if you weren't very persuasive, if you didn't know rhetoric, even if you're innocent, you're kind of shit out of luck, I mean, if you had somebody against you who had trained with the sophists and were able to make everyone angry against you, and even if they're lying, right, you might be found guilty because you just don't have a very eloquent way of defending yourself. So yeah, like Georgia says, a way to gain power, right? Rhetoric is definitely an effective way to gain power in a society like Athens. If you're doing this, if you're learning the art of rhetoric and your aim is power and political power, how important to you do you think is truth and being honest? Is that essential? Do you have to be truthful at the same time? Or is that negotiable? Yeah, Miss Crocker, she says no, right? Yeah, I mean, I guess you could tell the truth if it suits you, if it makes you look good, but if it doesn't, then just don't mention it, right? Again, I think, I'll try to just not get too political, but I think they do this on both the sides of the political spectrum, right? They won't admit the bad things their side does, but they like to point out the other team, right? So rhetoric, right? It has nothing to do with what's true or what's right or what's correct. It's just what is persuasive and what sounds good. And if we take Plato at his word, because we don't know a lot about the sophists, most of their writings don't survive. There's a few fragments in here and there, but we don't have a lot of information on them. Most of what we know about them is through Plato and other philosophers, and they're kind of like the arch rival of Plato. They're seen as, they were friendly, they were, friends, and they talked. They didn't like hate each other. They weren't like mean girls, but they were philosophical enemies, right? Because the sophists, according to Plato, if we believe him, they didn't seem to think there was such a thing as truth, or at least, and I don't know if that's the case. That's almost absurd to say there's no such thing as truth. Is that true, that there's no such thing as truth? It's kind of an inconsistent view, you see. You're making a claim about something. But it seems like people like Protagoras, at the very least, thought that there's no way to verify truth, and there is no way to even know if there is an absolute truth. All we have are our perspectives. All we have are our experiences, our beliefs. So if you've got two individuals, let's say you got two guys, they're standing outside, and a gust of wind comes by. One of them says it's cold, the other says it's warm. Protagoras would say it's neither. It's cold to him and warm to him. There is no what it is in itself. Everything is relative to the individual or the culture. There is no absolute truth. But when you get to people like Socrates, and I suppose I could say the same thing about Socrates that I said about the sophists, we don't know a lot about him, and most of what we know is through Plato. And Plato liked him, though. Plato liked Socrates. But it seems like Socrates held a much more objectivist view about truth. He thought, no, there are absolute truths. There are things that are just true. They don't depend on your beliefs. Okay, and I'm not just talking about geometrical truths. I'm not just talking about, all the angles inside a triangle add up to 180 degrees. That doesn't depend on your viewpoint or your opinion. It's just the nature of a triangle. Any shape that has three sides and all, always going to, it's not just geometrical, mathematical truths about science and physics. But Plato and Socrates seem to argue that no, a truth, even ethical truth, how to live a good life, what is virtuous, what is just, that these had good, correct answers that weren't relative, they weren't depending on my perspective, they weren't depending on my feelings, they were based on just truth, on what is actually real, and what is factual, what is objective, and it doesn't depend on context or the time or history. There's a universal sense of justice. And when we get to Plato's metaphysics, you're going to see that it's kind of a letdown, because these truths, even though they may exist, might not actually apply to this world. That might be kind of confusing at this point in our venture, but he had faith that there were such things as actual beauty and actual justice, and it wasn't just a matter of opinion, that there was a right way to live your life. And so he saw the sophists as this corrupting element in society, that they were the end of Athens, and that they were corrupting, which is ironic, because what is Socrates on trial for? Who got that far in the reading? What was one of the things Socrates was being accused of? Why was he put on trial and eventually executed? What were the accusations?
Pretty much for challenging people on what they did in life and their perspectives.
You're on the right track, but there were particular views and particular perspectives that he challenged that got him in trouble. But that wasn't exactly the charge I was looking for. Somebody was about to jump in. Was it Sean? I think that was who just talked. But one of the things that Socrates was accused of was corrupting the youth. That he was corrupting the youth of Athens because he was doing all those things you just said. Because he was questioning people's perspectives. He was questioning people's beliefs. He was pointing out flaws and inconsistencies in people's beliefs. And he was showing disrespect for particularly the religious beliefs of the city. That was what the charge was that he was not respecting the gods of Athens, right? Not respecting the gods of the city, the religious traditions of the city. So let's get to the first reading, or the very beginning of the first reading here. Let me get my copy. So again, there's some people here for the first time. I know some of y'all added late. So this is actually available on Blackboard. You should be able to get a PDF of this. And I'm starting right from the top. But before, I'm going to read the first opening lines here to sort of get us started. Let's look at what is the title all about. If you did the reading, or you got even halfway through the reading, you might be wondering why the hell they call it the Apology. Why do I say that? Well, maybe you read the footnote. If you read the footnote on the first page, it explains the title. Is Socrates apologizing? Is he being apologetic, do you think? What say you? No, definitely not. No, quite the opposite. He seems to actually be, especially towards the end of the reading, he seems to be pointing his finger at his accusers and kind of getting mad at them, and he's angry with them. So why is it the apology? Did you look at that or find that one out? Well, like I said, it's on the first page. There's a footnote that explains it. The Greek word is apologia. That's what the original work was titled in Greek, in the ancient Greek. What that means literally is legal defense. And so what we have here with the title is, it's what you would call a transliteration. It sounds like the original word. It's not a translation, it's a transliteration. So it sounds like apologia, but it definitely doesn't mean the same thing, right? In English, apology is like, I'm sorry, mea culpa. He's definitely not sorry, it seems like. I guess, though, it just sounds cooler, right? If I'm translating Plato and I'm an English, translator, I'm like, am I going to call it the legal defense or am I going to call it the apology? I guess I'll just call it the apology. Sometimes you do see in some textbooks, it'll be translated as the defense of Socrates. So we already got the charges on the table. I have them written here on my PowerPoint, right? So impiety is, there's a lot of things they mention in the reading, but you can kind of sum them up to these two main points. He's not being respectful of the gods. He's not being pious. He's not being respectful of the religions and the traditions of the city. And by doing this and by going around and questioning other people, he's setting a bad example and he's corrupting the youth of Athens. So these are pretty serious charges. He could actually face the death penalty, especially for corrupting the youth. And ultimately, that's what he does get. We'll see, right? He does get the death penalty. Socrates was indeed executed. But let's do the reading here. Let's start the reading and look at the first opening lines here. Apparently, this takes place like right after he's heard the accusers. So they've just finished their tirade and they've brought the charges forth. And so this is kind of his beginning of a response. So I'm starting right at the top. He says, "I do not know, men of Athens, how my accusers affected you. As for me, I was almost carried away in spite of myself, so persuasively did they speak. And yet, hardly anything of what they said is true. Of the many lies they told, one in particular surprised me, namely that you should be careful not to be deceived by an accomplished speaker like me. That they were not ashamed to be immediately proved wrong by the facts, when I show myself not to be an accomplished speaker at all. That, I thought, was most shameless on their part, unless indeed they call an accomplished speaker the man who speaks the truth." So right here at the outset, he begins his defense, if you want to call it that. He begins his defense by distinguishing himself from his accusers. And how is it that he's different from his accusers? Well, it's his manner of speaking, right? What does he say? He says, they say I speak this way, but I don't. They speak that way. I speak, well, what is the distinction? They speak what? I guess I'm kind of giving it away if you just look at the screen there, but what is their manner of speaking? He says he was almost carried away in spite of himself. Even though he knew what they said was false, even he almost believed it. Why? Why did he almost believe it? What was it about the way they talked?
Is it because of how persuasive they were?
Right, they were persuasive. They were using persuasive speech. I mean, he's not coming out and saying it, but he's basically saying they talk like sophists. They must have trained with the sophists. They learned rhetoric. They speak persuasively. I never trained with any sophists, says Socrates. I mean, he goes on to say, I'm not going to speak in the way you're used to. You're used to people up here talking all eloquently and persuasively. I'm just going to be very direct. I'm going to talk to you like I talk to anybody in the marketplace. And you might not like that. And so, he's making this distinction between speaking persuasively and speaking the truth. And I want to interject a little bit here. I think that there's this dichotomy, there's this distinction that Plato's making here, that we get through Socrates' defense, that runs throughout all of his works. And so whether you're reading the Apology or the Republic, or we're about to move on next week, maybe the end of the week next week if we're lucky, we'll move on to the Symposium, you're going to see that this distinction between appearance and reality, it runs throughout all of Plato. Sometimes an argument can be very persuasive, and if it's a very persuasive argument, it appears to be true, but it's not true. Just like, if I'm one of these prisoners down here in the cave, and all I know are the shadows, they seem really real. They appear to be true. How can you deny they're right there? But that's all you know. But that's just the appearance. It's a deception. And so this is a very important, I think, distinction for Plato. The things that appear and very persuasive, but when we actually look further for deeper reasons behind them, we find that the reality is something else, and that the appearance is an illusion, or it somehow misguides us. And also, and I put in parentheses here, usually the truth is hard to accept, right? Just like the people in the cave, they don't want to hear that there's another world out there. Maybe, they like their illusion. They like the shadows on the wall. That makes them comfortable, makes them feel good. They don't want to question themselves or their worldview. Ollie has a comment here. He says, isn't Plato also trying to dismantle the first premise of their argument that he's trying to corrupt the youth? I guess you could say that look, I'm just speaking truthfully, and that's not corrupting the youth, right? Maybe persuasion that's more corrupting, that's more deceptive. If that's what you have in mind, I guess, yeah, that maybe he's building a bit of a case for that, for sure. He's going to be a little bit more direct later. You're going to see, and we probably won't have time for this today. We'll probably run out of time before we get to the section I'm talking about, but there's a section with Meletus, one of his accusers, where I think he more directly addresses the charge of corruption, of corrupting the youth. But what does he do here? The first thing he does after this whole distinction between the way his speakers talk and the way he's about to talk, or just does talk, the next thing he does is a bit confusing to people who read this the first time. I know at least it was to me. He starts to tell us almost like his life story. You start to hear the story of Socrates, like his autobiography, and it's not really obvious how this is a defense. Like, how is he addressing the charges through this story? I would like to argue that he actually is, but it's definitely not obvious. And so we might not be able to get to that, my defense of why this is actually not a digression, that this story that he's about to tell us is actually important to his defense. We might not get to that part today, but what's the story I'm talking about? Basically, he says that, look, guys, I know what you're saying about me. You're saying that I don't respect the gods, that I'm misleading all the youth of Athens and corrupting them with all these bad arguments and bad ideas. But that's not true, but I know why you think it. He's like, I kind of understand why I have that reputation. It's not without foundation. It's not without foundation that these prisoners in the cave believe the shadows. They have a reason to believe it. It's very compelling to believe it, but it's not true. They're not true. They're just shadows of truth. And so this is kind of what he's saying, and he's giving us his story. And where does the story begin? It begins before this, but this is sort of where he picks it up. He says, well, it all began with a certain wisdom, a certain wisdom that I heard, something I heard about myself. In fact, he heard it through a friend, and his friend heard it from his brother. So it's like second, third-hand wisdom. I don't know if that maybe just credits it slightly. But he said that his friend Cherophon had a brother. and his brother went to visit the Oracle at Delphi. And the Oracle at Delphi told him something quite interesting, and Socrates found out about it. What did the Oracle at Delphi tell this guy? What did Socrates find out through Chaerephon? No one got that far? It's pretty early on in the reading, guys. Y'all need to do some of this stuff. What did the Oracle say about Socrates? It was on page... It starts on page 24. Well, first off, what the heck is an oracle? Does anybody even know what an oracle is? You ever watch The Matrix?
I was just gonna say that.
What is the oracle in The Matrix? What's she all about? Like, what's her role in the whole scheme of things?
He just knows everything.
Right. She just has all the knowledge, like all the wisdom. She sees everything. So you go visit her and you ask a question and she gives you the answer or whatever, right? Well, that's based on, that movie itself was actually quite influenced by Plato. And in Western philosophy in general, you could argue Descartes and stuff, but yeah, Miss Crocker, you got it. They were religious. It was actually a priestess. Usually it was a woman. In fact, it was always a woman in ancient Greece. I'm sure there were other oracles and other religious traditions, but in the Greek pagan, ancient, it was always a woman. It was a priestess, and they would be at these, temples outside of the cities, and you would go visit these temples, and you would ask the priestess this question. But it was believed, how is it that they had all the knowledge? What gave them that knowledge? How were they able to know all this stuff about everything? You kind of got it when you said When you said median, I think you meant medium, like a spiritual medium. Yeah. So they were a conduit, a medium. What does that mean?
They were able to talk to the gods.
Right. And maybe it's even better to characterize it. It's not even that they would talk to the gods. It wasn't even like they were like, the Pope who had like was able to know what God wants or whatever, right? At least that's what the Catholic religion believes. But they actually believe that the gods spoke through them. So like the oracle would go into some trance, and then all of a sudden, like the god would inhabit their body, and the god would speak through their body. And so yeah, it was like literally they would become possessed by Zeus or Hera. But in this case, the Oracle at Delphi, that particular one was seen as like one of the most important ones of all the oracles throughout the Greek world, because that oracle was believed to speak for Apollo. So the god Apollo spoke through that oracle. Why was that significant? Well, the god Apollo was known for truth. The god Apollo was associated with truth and honesty. That's the sun god. So Apollo is associated with lights, illuminating everything, letting truth shine forth, no shadows, right? And so if the Oracle at Delphi said it's true, then it's freaking true, right? Like Apollo doesn't lie. What did the Oracle say about Socrates? No one got that far in the reading, or no one knows the story?
Didn't she spread the rumor that he was like the wisest man or something like that?
Exactly, right. And I guess if you want to get nitpicky, what she actually said was, I think the person, Chaerephon's brother, just asked the Oracle, are there any wiser than Socrates? And the Oracle said, no, there are none wiser than Socrates. So if you want to be as wise as possible, be like Socrates, is basically what she was saying. There are none wiser than him. Well, how do you think he reacted to that? Or how did he react if you did the reading? I mean, I might have reacted like, maybe I'm kind of full of myself, but I would, oh, really? Wow, okay. I always thought I was pretty clever, but I didn't know I was the wisest. But I guess so. Cool, awesome, right? But that's not how he says he reacted. How did he react?
He denied it, right?
Yeah, he didn't quite believe it. He's like, that can't be true. That can't be quite right. And Why exactly is that? Why was he hesitant to believe it? Why was he so humble, do you think? I
because
mean,
he thought
why would you be that? Like let's say that some engineer like somehow figured out like this device that they could plug into your brain that could measure how smart you were, and then like they plugged it into your brain, and like they decided you're the smartest person in the world. We measured everyone's intelligence, and you're the smartest person in the universe. Like, when you start thinking, wait a minute, this machine doesn't quite work. I mean, I would probably think that, as full of myself as I am, I probably wouldn't trust the machine. I'd be like, that machine says I'm the smartest person on earth. That machine does not measure how smart you are. You can't measure how smart you are. And if you could, I definitely wouldn't be the smartest. Why would I say that? What would I be assuming? What is Socrates assuming?
that people in other fields had to be stronger or smarter than him.
There's got to be somebody out there smarter than me. There's got to be, right? Like you said, people who know their fields. Maybe you're thinking of when he went to visit the craftsmen, because he did think that they definitely knew more about their craft than he does. And certainly, I would be thinking of people like physicists or mathematicians that have PhD in pure mathematics and things like this. And I'm like, man, those guys are brainiacs. Surely they have a higher IQ than me. And so that's that's kind of the response that Socrates has. Certainly, there's got to be people out there who are more intelligent than me. So he decides he's got to go investigate, because he knows that the oracle must be telling the truth, but he also knows that the oracle would often speak in riddles. There's a famous story of the Greek king who wanted to go invade Persia and conquer the Persian Empire. And he asked the oracle if he should do it, and the oracle said, if you go invade Persia, a great empire will fall. So he got all excited, he invaded Persia, and his great empire fell. So, Socrates, he knows this, and he says, certainly the oracle there must be some deeper meaning here. There must be some riddle, and I've got to figure out what the riddle is. So he decides to investigate. And so what does he do? How does he investigate? How does he dig deeper? What does he do? Anybody? He goes around looking. What does he go looking for?
He interviews people
Right.
who he thinks are smarter than him, and as he continues to ask them questions about their field, it's like first they feel like they know everything, and then as time goes on, they realize that they don't know anything.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good summation. I mean, I don't know if we have time, because we got like maybe 10 minutes left, but we'll go in more detail. But that's a good summation of basically that kind of is what happens in every case. The more he questions the people he questions, the more obvious it is that they don't know what they're talking about. He goes to these people, as you said, who are known to be smart or have a reputation for wisdom, and in each case he uncovers that no, actually they're not as smart as he thought they might be, and the more he questions them, the more he realizes that that's the case. So who exactly does he question? There are three groups he seems to target more than anyone else. What kind of people do have who is it that has a reputation for being smart in his society, and who does he go to interrogate? I mean, I would go to talk to like physicists and mathematicians and things like that, but they didn't really have physicists and mathematicians the way they had mathematicians, but they didn't have like particle physicists the way they do today. So who were the people in his society who had a reputation for being wise, and who were the authority figures that he went to question? I've mentioned one of them already. You were talking about people who were, I think it was Sean or Ronnie who said this. The people who were experts in their field. What would you call that? Or what does he call that? People who had expertise in a certain field. And there's really like three groups who he targets here. I can't get one. Okay. All right. I'll do all three of them. Well, I'm going to let you sit on that for a minute. I'm going to read a section here from page 24. If you have a different version of this, I guess it's line 21. I can't even see the margins here. I think it's 21B in the margins. Yeah, 21B. Yeah, and he says, consider I tell you this, because I would inform you about the origin of the slander. Right? Why do I have this bad reputation? Why are people slandering me and saying I'm impious and corrupting you? Well, when I heard of this reply, when he heard what the oracle said about him, that he's the wisest, when I heard this reply, I asked myself, whatever does the god mean? What is his riddle? I'm very conscious that I'm not wise at all. What then does he mean by saying that I'm wisest, right? So he's aware of his own ignorance. He's like, there's so much I want to know that I don't know. How could I be the wisest? Surely someone knows more than I do. But surely the God does not lie. It's not legitimate for him to do so. So for a long time, I was at a loss as to his meaning. And then I very reluctantly turned to some such investigation as this. I went to one of those reputed wise, thinking that there, if anywhere, I could refute the oracle and say to it, this man is wiser than I, but you said that I was wisest. Well, then when I examined this man, there's no need for me to tell you his name. He was one of our public men. My experience was something like this. I thought that he appeared wise to many people, and especially to himself, but he was not. There it is again. I told you that appearing true, appearing wise, but not really being in reality, right? Appearance versus reality. So he appeared wise. He thought himself wise, but he was not. And then I tried to show him that he thought himself wise, but that he was not. And as a result, he came to dislike me. And so did many of the bystanders. And so I withdrew, and I thought to myself, I am wiser than this man. It's likely that neither of us knows anything worthwhile, but he thinks he knows something when he does not. Whereas when I do not know, neither do I think that I know. And so I'm likely to be wiser than he is to this small extent, that I do not think I know what I do not know. After this, I approached another man, one of those I thought wiser than him. And I thought the same thing. And so I came to be disliked both by him and by many others. So Socrates goes around questioning people. It's not making them happy. It's kind of pissing them off. But who's the first group he goes to? He says he goes to one of our public men. What does he mean by that? A public man.
Politicians.
Good. So the first group that he attacks are the politicians. Who does he go to next? I've given y'all like 5 minutes to figure it out. No one, Sean, you got it?
The craftsman.
Good. So we got 2 out of 3. The politicians, the craftsmen.
And
Anyone
the
else? Yeah, what'd you say it again?
poets.
Good. All right. Yeah. So we've got these 3 groups. The first one he attacks to the politicians. Then he moves on to the poets. And really by poet, you ought to be thinking artists or creative types. He's talking about actual playwrights, people who write plays. But he could also be talking about Homer, the epic poet. But we would probably talk about musicians and celebrities and actors like that. That'd be like the modern day analog, I suppose, if there had to be one. But yeah, the people in power, the politicians, the poets, and then the craftsmen, the tradesmen, the people who have a trade or a skill. And in each case, he starts to realize that in a way, he is wiser than them. And why is that? What is it about him that makes him wiser than all these people?
Those people think that their knowledge is beyond what it actually is.
Exactly. They think they know things they don't know. Whereas he is well aware of his ignorance. When he doesn't know something, he knows he doesn't know it. And so he goes to talk to them and he questions them and they asks them about, asks them things about beauty and justice and gets their views on these things. And then he basically tears them apart. He says, that's not justice. That's not beauty. How is that? And it's not making them happy. So we're almost out of time. I guess I should stop there. What we're going to do next class is we're going to go through in a little bit more detail, kind of what happens to each group and how he, how he interacts with the poets and the craftsmen. And I think, but you're right. Your answer is right. I think in general, that's the general consensus is that they all think they know something that they don't for different kind of reasons. So we'll explore that, next meeting. And then we'll move on to the rest of his defense. He starts to cross-examine one of his accusers, Meletus, and then we might even get into the sentencing. I don't know if we're going to get that far next meeting, but it definitely wouldn't hurt, if you have time over the weekend to try to finish the apology, because I want to get as close to the end next class. We're going to cover as much of the apology as possible. I'm hoping that by the end of the week next week, like 1 week from today, that, by the end of the week, we'll at least get a good start, maybe like a very, small start, but a start on the Symposium, right, on that next Plato reading. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to stop recording, and I'll stick around